Welcome to the Alchemist Manifesto, a podcast with Mario Ovando and Daniel Topete. We are two friends holding space and making time to hold holistic and humanizing pláticas and charlas with the aim of alchemizing our individual experiences into shared healing and wisdom. The amistad that produces this podcast emerges from our shared commitment to social justice as teachers and scholars in the field of critical and relational ethnic studies, and of course, our creative and everyday efforts to imagine better worlds with our loved ones, communities, and spirits.
Rather than a conventional written manifesto, our podcast welcomes you to an evolving, living, and breathing journey rooted in the beauty of alchemy through amistad, and the palabras, cuentos, and testimonios that emerge in this sacred ceremony of bringing our spirits together and transmitting them with you. We channel a welcome via one of my beloved artists, Frank Ocean, the blonded prince of Nostalgia Ultra, who reminds us to consider the preciousness of life in his cover of Strawberry Swing. We are all mortals, aren't we? Any moment this could go. And who grounds this episode with a reminder to all who listen to us today that as the entire earth is fighting, and it may seem that all the world is at its end, that I should say and you should hear that I've loved the good times here in this Alchemist Manifesto. Sending love and peace your way. I'm Mario Alberto Ovando. Thank you to everyone who listened to our trailer. We're inspired by your kind words and energized by each of you asking us when the first episode would stream. In an effort to introduce ourselves to you all, we are starting our podcast journey with interviewing each other. Today's podcast is part one of an interview with my co-creator, co-host, and above all, my friend, Daniel Topete. Sin duda, our spirits were destined to meet. Stubbornly and patiently as the years went by, it became clearer and clearer that our spirits wanted to share our truths, wounds, and pain to one another. Whenever I share my experiences, Danny's always there to be supportive, non-judgmental, caring, and in solidarity. He's one of the best listeners I know. Whenever I have something to vent, he validates what I say and finds a way to connect to what's going on. In addition to being a wonderful father to the sunshine that is his son Diego, Danny's also the partner of my partner's sister and my close friend, Reina. Danny's a kindred spirit who loves rock en español and video games. He's an amazing chef who cooks up bomb vegan dishes, which, as you'll learn in the podcast, are made with his ancestors' guidance. Danny loves sports. Like myself, we love the Dodgers and Lakers and enjoy sports talk radio. Also in awe of Danny's capacity to absorb information and apply knowledge. I can honestly say that if I was into gambling, I would put my money on Danny winning any board game or competition. Danny's also a caring teacher and scholar. He teaches Chicana and Chicano studies at Cal State LA, and we met at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where we both completed our PhDs in American Studies. I've had the honor of him guest lecturing in my classes and providing talks when I coordinate fellowship programs. And what I admire most about Danny is that he's just as compassionate in his research as he is rigorous. He is grounded in the reality of meeting people where they are, rather than for where he'd like them to be. I've had the honor of reading his research. His dissertation, Taking Back Mi Lengua, Spanish Rock, Space, and Authenticity in Chicana and Chicano Barrios and Academia, which he completed in 2016, as well as a recent book chapter, inform and shape my interview of him today. His research focuses on the importance of Chicanx popular culture and music in shaping new identities and possibilities for Chicanx and Latinx communities. Danny's work emerges from his capacity to be vulnerable and share the pain that he went through in losing his tongue and finding it through music. I've had the privilege of being in the presence of him playing vinyls and absorbing his wide-reaching knowledge of how artists of color in the US and in the global South sample and collaborate with one another. His research methods enact the very way of being that he desires. I find inspiration in the way He lives his life, raises his son, is a partner, teaches, and moves gently in this harsh world. Our interview features us referencing Frank Ocean's Strawberry Swings from Nostalgia Ultra in the beginning. We did so to highlight the importance of getting together virtually within the context of this pandemic and the continued suffering and pain we're all experiencing. The song reminds us of our mortality, the preciousness of life, the beauty of nostalgia, and the presentness of childhood, the love we appreciated feeling on our time on Earth, and in the unfairness of who gets to live and die during times of violence. The lyrics of the song read, "When we were kids, we hand-painted strawberries on a swing. Every moment was so precious then. I'm still kicking it. I'm daydreaming on a strawberry swing. The entire earth is fighting. All the world is at its end. Just in case an atom bomb comes falling on my lawn, I should say, and you should hear, I've loved the good times here. I've loved our good times here. Say hello, then say farewell to the places you know. We're all mortals, aren't we? Any moment this could go. Cry, 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 even though that won't change a thing. But you should know, you should hear that I've loved the good times here, and we'll miss our good times. Spaceships are lifting off a dying world, and millions are left behind while the sky burns. There wasn't room for you and I, only you. Goodbye, goodbye. We send love to all who are mourning, ill, and searching for healing." On a Monday afternoon, over Zoom with a cup of coffee in hand and a lighthearted urgency to learn more about my friend, I sat virtually with Danny and asked him questions about his life, his writing, and his teaching. Knowing that I was borrowing precious family time where he could play and laugh with his dedo, our affectionate apodo for his son Diego, and the incoming belly grumbling of dinner approaching, I listened closely and attentively. A testament to our amistad, his answers hit me at my core, and to the era of inspiration, I talked a bit too much. With this said, I feel that this reveals a snapshot of Danny's capacity to inspire and awaken spirit. On the eve of another event of white supremacist violence, our interview stands as an important alchemy of trauma and humbly invites and conjures self-reflection, love, contemplation, and vulnerability in a society where arrogance, hate, power, and violence dominate. Considering the histories of colonization, historical trauma, and erasure for Chicanx, Latinx, Indigenous, and Black folks, our conversation explored how do we navigate our sense of belonging in a society that delegitimizes our ways of being and knowing? How might memory and intentionally connecting with our ancestors foster wholeness in our lives and teaching? How does love ground his work and life? How do we alchemize trauma into lessons and keep working through pain rather than numbing it or going around it? In it, we learned more about each other, where our journeys can take us, and most of all, came to a serious realization of the importance of coming together. Our stories of alchemy can be treasures that we leave behind, as well as time well spent, in the spirit of listening to our fragile present moment. It is in this vein that I welcome you to eavesdrop and listen to the vulnerability of our memories, stories, and efforts. Enjoy. One of the things that I've learned in oral history work is that, what we're doing here is our skin, it's our flesh, it's our bones, but it's not our marrow, right? So like bone marrow is this kind of like empty space, these sacs, spongy sacs in our bone. And that can't be explained in words, right? So what we're getting is just a piece of what we're releasing into the world. But there's so much left unspoken, and that no interview can actually capture the fullness and richness of who you are. And I say that with like the full humility of what I think interviews should be about, which is kind of capture a snapshot, and that the fullness of our lives can never be expressed in language, especially in these colonial tongues that we have. which for me, as I thought about interviewing you, was such an important piece of who you are, right? It's kind of, how do we decolonize our spirit? How do we find our voice? How do we find our tongue? How do we find our energy? So I know we've both agreed to do the podcast together, man, but thanks, dude. Like, thanks for being here. Thanks for being alive with me. And welcome, man.
I appreciate that. I echo that completely, right? I feel like this is part of that process of healing, right? On that healing path that you mentioned for me as well. Like, I remember a couple of years ago when you first mentioned this to me, oh, we should just record some of these things and create a podcast a few years ago. I was like, absolutely effing not. I can't do that. Like, who cares about what I have to say, right? Like, and again, all of those messages that I've had throughout my life, right, really got magnified in those moments, right? And it took me a while. It took me a couple of years, right, to actually be like, let's do this, right? Let's do this. And again, like you were mentioning before, like, I think the pandemic really highlighted those moments of anxiety that I felt around sharing me, right? Sharing who I am, my light, right? Even with myself, right? I definitely feel like it is this part of healing for me, that this podcast and sharing, we've shared before, and it's very difficult for me to share, but on this platform, right, it just kind of really, I think, makes me start to feel comfortable with that vulnerability, right? Especially as I think about, even as an instructor, right? Like, being in the classroom and exposing myself, right, to a group of basically 40 strangers in the beginning, right, of the semester, right? But I feel like being vulnerable, being open, being receptive, has really allowed me to think about, who I really want to be, right? Who really makes me feel happy, right? Because this closed off person that doesn't trust anyone, maybe it worked for me in the past, but it doesn't work anymore. And so, yeah, I definitely want to thank you for nudging, giving me that little nudge, man, and that little jump start to feel brave enough to do these kinds of things.
Something really beautiful that I think links us, which is a shared mentor and advisor, which is Eden Torres. A shout out to Eden, a really kind of formative person in me writing my dissertation and you finishing your dissertation in American Studies at U of M. And in your diss, you actually highlight something from Chicana Without Apology, the new Chicana cultural studies. And I wanted to share the quote because I think it really resonated with where you started. And Eden writes, you cite Eden, right? And so you're kind of borrowing from her work. She writes, though individuals deal with and respond to trauma and massive loss in a variety of ways, as a group, Chicanas and Chicanos have not been allowed to or had the time to mourn or heal. Our grief is as disenfranchised and disavowed as we have been. For many Mexican Americans, the memory itself has been erased in U.S. history classrooms. While many rally around cries to never forget the horrors of Nazi crimes, no mainstream angst has been noted as Chicano, and indigenous histories have been rendered invisible. Thus, it is almost impossible for us to understand the link between this memory of trauma and the extent of the devastation that comes from the shaming practices to which we are currently subjected. And that's of course from Eden's book, Chicana Without Apology, the new Chicana cultural studies. That's actually on page 23. And Danny writes, this trauma is often inflicted on students from a young age and starts to manifest itself into resistant action when its effects become a visible obstacle to overcome, like being told that you will not graduate. Feelings of powerlessness, powerlessness and lack of agency makes students of color not only lose connection with their education, but they can learn to hate it. And so, I'm reading that because as I was reading your diss again and engaging your writing and thinking about chatting with you, that's something that we're doing here too, right? It's trying to kind of capture our memory, capture our story. When we say the word disenfranchised, it typically connotates voting or money, access to money. But I love that book too, Eden's book, the disenfranchisement of memory. So I guess my question is, man, how is memory so important in your work, specifically in your life as well, in remembering the past, even when it's hurtful? And how do folks for instance, Eden and Eden's work, how have they kind of helped you transform some of those memories?
That's a good question. As we have mentioned, right, to try to alchemize, right, these at times traumatizing, right, pasts, right, that I am a strong believer that those traumas have been passed down from generation to generation, and we've inherited not only the systems that produce that, right, because those systems are still with us today, right, but I am a strong believer that those traumas are still with us, right, and we're still now trying to deal, right, and trying to navigate some of those past moments, even in our current moment of like you were mentioning, things like elections and things like politics, right? There's a reason why, there's a lot of people of color, right, that still don't believe in the system, right? That still are betrayed and and are hurt and are trying to feel a part of a world that has historically told them that they don't belong. And to me, it's a difficult moment to think about, how do I navigate my sense of belonging in that world? Trying to really tap into these ancestral wisdoms and feelings and connections to the world in a place that tells us to forget that, in an institution that tells us, forget your languages, forget your culture, forget your who you are, cut your hair, change your dress, put on a suit to be professional, and feel completely fraudulent in that space and try to navigate in that space. To me, having gone through a lot of those spaces made me really dedicate my life to remembering, right, to trying to remember that feeling of wholeness, because I didn't feel whole in those spaces. And as I reflect, right, I was using alcohol first and foremost, and smoking as well, as a way to basically numb those feelings of imposter syndrome almost, right? This is who I'm supposed to be to succeed in those spaces. And it felt completely like shit. And the more and more I recognized that that was what was happening inside of me, the more and more traumatized I started feeling. I think it got completely magnified when we were in Minnesota, because grad school is difficult as it is, but also being away from home for the first time and doing all those things, I began to think about what connections I can make in myself to really focus and meditate on a spirit almost. Because of colonization, most of our histories have been erased, and our ancestors' books have been destroyed. But how do I try to intentionally remember that spirit? And it can look a variety of ways, right? I know there's a lot of talk about authenticity around indigeneity and things like that. That is important to have as well, to be conscious of. But I think in these moments where we are trying to navigate these spaces that have destroyed who we've been, and try to remember who I am, that again is doing it in a spirit of remembering positively and trying to create a positive environment for myself and those around me, right? That again is an honor of that, of those legacies and memories from the past, right? And yeah, Eden's writing was earth-shattering for me. It validated a lot of my feelings as well. It put words to them. It eased some of my anxieties about being in spaces like academia, right? And to say like, okay, there is a space for folks, like Eden and myself, as an extent. Yeah, I'm not comparing myself to Eden. She's genius and awesome, but in that spirit, to be like, almost like an extension of that, right? An extension of that positive energy. So yeah, I think, thinking about memory and bringing some of those moments in a very intentional and everyday life, I try to honor those things and thank the ancestors for that. Like sometimes I like cooking. Cooking puts me in a zone that kind of like makes me quiet almost, some of those voices. And sometimes I'm just like, I remember my grandma did this one dish with no recipe, just out of memory. I try to replicate it. I don't know. I mean, I'm my own hardest critic, or worst critic, what they say, but I do it in that spirit of be like, okay, like there's something there that had been passed down for probably her grandmother, right? And their grandmother and what have you, that I think is like, even something as simple as that, I try to incorporate that spirit of remembering to be like, okay, like you're still with me, dedicating this moment in that spirit of growing and healing, and also to challenge again those voices that have told me to forget where we come from, who we are, right?
And I think that's like you mentioned like fraudulent imposter, and then at the other end we're thinking of it then and Minneapolis, and it's one of the rationalizations that folks have used to justify the murder of George Floyd was the counterfeit bill. And I think so much about the consequences, both physically, materially, spiritually, to white supremacy, colonialism, they're so catastrophic because they value their own sets of fictions, right? The fiction that there is a currency that is the one that should be paid. It should be the one that you get your hands on, right? It's the one with all the slave owners. That's the money that's real, right? George Washington, I don't know who else, who are the other slave owners on dollar bills, that's real, and there's so much, there's so much to honoring what we know to be real knowledges, what we know to be real wisdoms, what we know to be real ways of being that are not mythical. They're not, in the space of folklore. They're not, they're not tradition in like the way that they're very real, and they're ancestral energies that we really carry. And you were talking about cooking like this, that's real, like to know the recipe without even needing to look it up, right? And that's part, not just valuing ourselves, and not just resisting the structure of power, but living our lives with centering, loving ourselves, and centering, healing, because these structures, they think that they're going to stay the same forever, but here we are talking about how they're the ones that in their fictions create violence, and that's so much for me, man, of like when I was reading your work and thinking about our friendship, that just kind of resonates with me, is the way that you think about what you do in your job as a teacher, what you do in your life, and also as a writer too. I know that that's not necessarily an identity that like you like really affirm yourself in, but I see you as a writer too, And in reading your writing, I love the way you use music. I love it. They're like these headlines, or like your subheadings are always connected to music, almost like these like reminders that, right, there's other ways of connecting to what's on the page. And I've been probably bothering you with this quote, but over the last week as we've been prepping for this, but you quoted in one of your chapters, and it's from Los Fabulosos Cadillacs, that I love, man, because I think it's really connected to what we're talking about. And it's en la escuela nos enseñan a memorizar fechas de batallas, pero qué poco nos enseñan de amor. So in school, right, we're taught to memorize war dates, and we're taught to memorize leaders and battle and these kind of hyper masculine ways of being, right? The militaristic man who's going to redeem motherland and save all the women and children. But there, you cite that in thinking about claiming your voice in space in these systems in the US K through 12 systems of heavy indoctrination, both as instrumental in the curriculum and also culturally, because that's what it means to be a man. And as we think about like what we're supposed to remember what it means to be like this tough, strong man who's willing to lay your life for the nation state. I'm really interested in sharing, and hearing from you about how central and important love is to how you think about your job, your life, your work, and how, quite interestingly enough, right, it's not, you don't go to school to learn about that, right? Which seems weird, but it's by design then, right? That love is not the design at school, right? It's discipline. It's that progressive model of the early 1900s of public education to create good citizens, to create, good workers that know how to listen to an alarm bell, ding, and when to be productive. How is love, both in your education and your decolonial education, but how does that inform like the way you engage like your life too, your writing, and how you try to look back at some of those memories of violence and trauma with love? And
yeah, no, I think that, definitely thinking about some of those almost stereotypical, but and I don't think it is spoken about enough. Like you mentioned, this sense of like what education has meant in this nation specifically, but not just this nation, right, throughout the world. And it has been about, right, this sense of almost indoctrination, this devotion and unquestioned devotion to the nation, right, to whatever nation we're talking about here. Obviously we're talking about the US, but and when I think about when I first started actually entering a classroom from that standpoint, I was as the instructor, right, I definitely felt like I was trying to replicate, right, those images that I've had of what the professor is, right, or the instructor is, right. And I felt very disconnected from the students, right. It was like, do this, and you'll get the passing grade. Don't do it, it's up to you, whatever, I don't care. And to be honest, it didn't make me happy. It didn't make me feel like I was doing anything, right? It felt like a job. It felt like, I felt like a disgruntled worker, right? I felt like, again, I was just doing it for the paycheck. And I know that that's what, like you mentioned, that's what, we were trained to do, right? Be this worker. But that again, it didn't make me feel whole. It didn't make me feel happy. It made me feel even like, like I said, like, man, I wasted so many years of my life to get this degree to do this. Like, it wasn't what I envisioned. And then, I started to do a lot of self-healing, reflection. And I think like I mentioned earlier, I started being a little bit more vulnerable, being more personable, sharing more about who I was. And I noticed that students started gravitating toward me a lot differently than before. And I noticed that I was making connections with them beyond, like, you know, teacher, student, right? And that's where I started to think about, like, this is where my spirit feels happy, right? Sending out this positivity, sending out this love, sending out this sense of, like, I want you to be not just succeed in this classroom and get a name, but I want you to be a happy person, right? I want you to see yourself, right? And I want you to see this material that we're talking about here, as difficult as it can be, right? See that reflection about, you know, how you might be feeling like I felt before, and say, like, no, right? Like, you know what? Me, I see you. I see who you are, because I am you. And I know that those past messages of negativity had made me feel less than, had made me feel, you know, like, made me have a low self-esteem, right? And question even the successes that I had, and made me question them, like, did I really deserve that, right? And again, that, I think, is all a part of that motion as a person of color in this world. We're given things, right? We don't earn them, right? And when I started to, you know, challenge those narratives within myself, I felt like I was doing that. I was trying to open that space up for my students as well, to be like, you know what, like, love yourself, right? Love yourself. Those narratives that have historically been written about you in this nation and your ancestors is bullshit.
Yeah.
I mentioned that, like, let's write our own story, right? Let's write our own story. Let's put value in our own stories, right? Let's love ourselves and love our own stories, right? About who we are, right? That, you know, I think definitely has continued to grow. This last, you know, again, bringing it back to the pandemic, I think even more, I'm like trying to bring in that love to the classroom. It's like,
Yeah.
dude, people are dying, you know. I have a lot of young students who maybe are getting over it, but what about their parents, right? What about their loved ones, right? What about them losing their jobs and now they can't pay for tuition? Oh, you didn't turn in a paper, now I'm gonna give you like an F? Like, no. I'm not gonna allow that institutional message of, like, earning these things to kind of question even my own humanity here, to be like, you know what, like, you know what, you did enough. Like, handle your business at home, you know. If you want to take another class with me when all this is done, and, you know, we could, like, this is also a learning moment, right? That is also a learning moment for us, you know. And, you know, my partner always tells me, right, they're going to remember more that compassion than whatever the flip we taught, right? And I think that's also a part of the message that we need to be sending, right? And I want that to also be very central, right? And who I am as a person, but who I am as an instructor, because that's also tied to who I am as a person. I think it needs to be critically important.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I was having a flashback to Minnesota, and in one of my graduate seminars, you're a grad student, you have a lot going on, you're broke, and you're trying to make ends meet, and you're trying to figure out, like, heavy theory and all this other stuff. And we were complaining about, you know, these requirements that we had to fulfill. And the professor told us, that's just the way it is. If I had to go through it and I got through it, you have to go through it. You'll get through it. And I've had, I don't want to say every experience has been like that. That's a very common experience of, that's just the way it is. That's how, if I did it, that's the way you got to do it. That's the metric. That's the system. And alchemy is different. Alchemy is, it's something that I'm hearing you describe, which is, be mindful of your traumas, because they might teach you something that someone who's going through that, if you heal that wound and it becomes a scar, you know, that's going to be an opportunity for you to like hold that same compassion to a student, really to yourself, because, you know, they're really reflections of us. And so that the message is not, well, life's traumatic, you know, deal with it. And here's my path of how, you know, it's like, and that's important. I mean, you know, I think that's something that you and I talk about a lot, is how do we learn from our experiences so we're not doing the same thing?
Right.
That's like that's on so many different levels, not just in education. That's about parenting, that's about relationships. Like, how do I, you know, do it differently? And that's so interesting you say that, because I have a journal when I'm in classes. You know, at first it was just like I was taking notes, and then the professor did something and said something that really felt dehumanizing while we were doing social justice stuff. Like, let me be clear about that. These are not just in random classes.
Right.
And then I started keeping kind of a journal of, here's what I'm not going to do. Right. And that, I think, is about healing. And I also think it's about seeing the wounds as something that's learnable, that's something that there's something to be learned there. There's something to take from the pain, right? Because it's going to keep confronting you constantly. It's not you heal it and then it goes away. No, it's going to be there. That's actually why we need to heal stuff more urgently, because it's going to keep popping up. And for me, that's been such a pivotal part of our like friendship in talking about school and education. It's not just doing the same thing over again. It's, here are my experiences. How do I do this differently? How do we create a new context? What I found to be very insidious about the pandemic is it's almost like we're pushing up against the pandemic's teaching us, no, you can't do things the way you've always done them. Damn it. But then I still see the way that pushes up against our mortality, right? Like it's like we're more trained to be humans than we're trained to be mortals, right? Like we're more trained to be the human vis-a-vis worker, right? That we're workers and we have a duty and a allegiance to the institution or the job, rather than our mortality, which is life, right? And mortality of ourselves and of others. And that actually requires, you know, stepping back and healing and moving and with the ebbs and flows of what the universe is giving you, right? Which is some very clear messages about, you know, the food we consume, you know, the reality of how whether or not we actually care about not just public health, global health, right? Without these racist, quote unquote, you know, calling the virus a racial slur. Right. Whether or not we actually care about that. And I think that's really pivotal in what I see in all of your work, man. It's like, and in your life and in your writing, it's like, I don't want to do, it's, you can't just go autopilot and keep teaching the way it's always been done. You learn, right? Because there's some dope things that people do, but it is about personal reflection, contemplation, and something that Grace Lee Boggs and her life story has taught me is that reflection is just as important in activism as action is. They're actually, right, critical to revolutionary struggle. And so I hear that, and I'd like to, you know, kind of throw it your way about how that's informed, you know, the person you are. It's just, you know, how did you come to everything you're saying, right? Like of this evolution and staying contemplative, staying reflective, and not just doing this, oh, that's just the way it is.
Yeah. No, I definitely feel like that last you know, quote that you mentioned also reminds me of this quote that every Valentine's I put it up, and it's by
Audre Lorde.
Audre Lorde, thank you. See, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And the quote is like, you know, self-love is one of the most revolutionary acts a person of color can do, right? And that's something that, again, I've struggled with for a very long time, right? And coming from a working class community, like Anzaldúa says, right, living in these borderlands and that Nepantla kind of, space, right? There's a lot of questions that, folks in this position have to, maybe not answer, but navigate, right? And even as a teenager, right, those questions were kind of brought to my attention. I was just writing this piece right now about thinking about, Prop 187 when I was about seventh, eighth grade. So I must have been like 13 years old when that was happening. And again, like, I had an image of what it meant to be successful in this country, and it was learning English, like speaking it well, and doing all your work, and going to school every day, and doing all of whatever your teachers told you, learning that history, right? And then when Prop 187 passed and people were like hopping fences, one of my friends didn't even like jump that fence, right? Because for those of us in Southern California, right, our schools have these huge ass fences that it's like a prison. They lock the fence, and it's literally like you have to climb a 12-foot fence if you want to get over it. And so a lot of kids were jumping. I had no idea, right? Like, I was already so invested in being successful in this nation, being a good student. And I remember one of my friends pinned a little Mexican bandana on his jacket and was suspended for that. And I was like, what's going on? What's going on here? Right? And to be honest, that's the earliest moment that I remember reflecting about how are my teachers looking at me, right? Just because of who I am. And that basically opened the door for thinking about, right, my path from there on out, to be like, let's explore some of these questions, because I'm not comfortable with what just happened here, right? Even as a kid, right? I didn't know how to articulate it. I just know how it made me feel. And it didn't make me feel good. And a lot of times, these are some of the questions that keep coming up. I don't like the histories that I uncover, right? Or that come to me, or, not come to me, but, that I learn about, or what I, try to research as a part of my job. But I also, it puts into context, right, those stares that I was getting as a 7-year-old, a seventh grader, eighth grader. And from my white teachers and my white administrators, like, it put all that history has put those moments into context for me, that I'm now thinking about, like, you're right, I'm not going to replicate that. I'm going to try not to replicate that stare of, like, you're doing it wrong. I did it, right? Like, and I struggled to do it. Like, now you're going to do it, right? And I'm going to be that same a-hole like my instructor was to me, right? I'm just going to keep passing that lineage down. No, I'm not, right? And I think, it's a hard thing to navigate at times, because it feels like I'm doing it wrong a lot. But the more and more I do it, and the more and more I see the connection that I have to students who, keep taking my classes, keep looking for me, right? Sending positive messages of them going on to do great things. I'm like, okay, like, I wasn't just an instructor that taught them one class, right? We created something that they keep thinking about, that classroom, that what they felt, how that made them, like, curious about the same things that I was curious about, creating those same sparks that were created for me at those moments, right? As difficult as it can be at times, to say, what, we're going to transform them into something positive, and feel like they're that little extra push, right, to completing some of these, external, like, goals or whatever about, it can't, again, this country values the worker, right? We had to play that game at times. but not losing the humanity, like you said, not losing the mortality along the way, because I think that's what I'm not okay with. Thank you for sharing your time and inviting us into your day here at the Alchemist Manifesto. We invite you to listen to part 2 of today's episode. Feel free to share your thoughts, responses, and questions via direct message on Instagram at The Alchemist Manifesto or via email at thealchemistmanifesto@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you.
A reminder that if you feel stuck, that from the mud grows the lotus. A special shout out to Jaime A. Talavera for the musical intro and to Joel Ureña Mora for your work on our social media. We appreciate you both.